12 seconds. That is all it took. Not a speech, not a summit, not a carefully negotiated breakdown behind closed doors. 12 seconds inside a room that was supposed to be routine, between two leaders who were supposed to be allies, in front of cameras that were supposed to capture diplomacy. Instead, they captured something that no one in that room was prepared for. A single word landed like a strike across the podium, and what followed was not a fight, not a walkout, not an explosion of political outrage. What followed was silence, the kind of silence that does not happen by accident, the kind that is built deliberately by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. And by the time that silence ended, the most dominant political communicator on the global stage was standing at his own podium, looking at a man who had just said less than he did, and somehow said more. The morning that room was arranged, nobody expected history. That is the part that makes what happened so difficult to process even now. Because moments that shift the way the world understands power rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive inside ordinary schedules, between prepared statements, inside press conferences that were never supposed to matter. This one was supposed to matter only in the most routine way possible. Trade language, energy agreements, the familiar diplomatic vocabulary that two neighboring governments had been exchanging for decades, without incident. Washington had its messaging prepared. Ottawa had its position structured. Reporters had their angles ready. Everyone in that room had already decided, before anything was said, that they were about to witness something predictable. That assumption lasted until it did not. Donald Trump entered the room carrying the confidence that had defined every major public appearance of his political career. It was not arrogance in the way his critics often described it. It was something more specific than that. It was the comfort of a man who had stood in more rooms like this one than almost anyone alive, who had learned through repetition exactly how these environments respond to force, and who understood that the first person to define the terms of an exchange usually controls where it ends. He spoke first. His tone was direct, his pacing familiar, his language sharp, but still calibrated within the expected range of political performance. He addressed trade imbalances, he addressed economic conditions, he addressed what he described as patterns of unfair treatment in cross-border agreements that had persisted too long without correction. Standing beside him was Mark Carney, not reacting, not shifting, not signaling anything to the room about what he was thinking or preparing to say. Just present, still in a way that was almost unusual for the environment, because press conferences at this level are rarely still. They are full of movement, of subtle repositioning, of small physical signals that experienced observers read the way others read text. But Carney offered almost none of that. He stood with the kind of composure that does not come from suppressing reaction. It comes from not having a reaction that needs suppressing. He was simply waiting. And that waiting, before a single confrontational word had even been spoken, already carried a weight that a few people in the room had begun to notice. For several minutes, the exchange remained inside its expected boundaries. Trump continued. His intensity increased gradually, the way it typically does when he moves from opening position into direct argument. His pauses shortened. His focus began to narrow away from the general subject of trade policy and toward something more specific, something more personal in its framing. The language was shifting, almost invisibly at first, from policy description into judgment, from explaining a position to characterizing one. And then, without dramatic build-up, without extended warning, the shift completed itself in a single word. Trump looked directly toward Carney, and described Canada's position in the ongoing negotiations as pathetic. The word did not echo through the room. It did not need to, it struck. There's a difference between a word that fills a space and a word that changes it, and everyone present understood in the same instant which kind had just been used. Reporters who had been mid-note stopped. Staff members positioned along the walls stopped. Even the ambient rhythm of the room, the small sounds and small movements that press environments always carry, seemed to pause for a moment as if the space itself needed a second to process what language had just entered it, because this was not frustration between negotiators in a private setting. This was not a leaked comment or an off-record remark later attributed and disputed. This was a public characterization, delivered face-to-face, on a stage visible to every major outlet in the world, between the leader of the United States and the leader of a nation that shared the longest peaceful border on Earth. Disagreement between allies is expected. Pressure is expected. Even sharp language in moments of genuine tension is not historically unusual. But public humiliation delivered directly, without intermediary, without diplomatic softening, without even the pretense of measured language, carries a different classification entirely. It does not function like a policy disagreement. It functions like a signal. And the room understood that, even before anyone had decided how to respond to it. Carney did not respond immediately. That decision, which may have looked like hesitation to someone watching without context, was not hesitation. The distinction matters because hesitation and deliberateness can appear identical from the outside, while being completely opposite in origin. Hesitation comes from not knowing what to do next. What Carney did came from knowing exactly what to do and choosing the precise moment to do it. He did not reach for words. He did not adjust his posture defensively. He did not look toward staff or advisors or anywhere that would suggest he was searching for guidance. He simply held the moment, let it exist without rushing to fill it. And in doing so, he did something that almost no one in a room full of trained political communicators expected. He made the silence louder than the word. That pause lasted only a few seconds in real time. But inside a room where every camera was locked, where every reporter had gone still, where even the most experienced observers had stopped their normal routines of capturing and categorizing information, a few seconds does not function the way it does in ordinary conversation. It expands, it fills, it forces every person present to sit inside the weight of what has just been said without the relief of immediate movement forward. Trump stood at the podium with the expression of someone who expected the moment to pass the way these moments usually pass. An insult lands, a recovery follows, tension spikes, and then finds its release in the next exchange. That is the pattern. That is how rooms like this one return to order. But the pattern did not activate, because the person it depended on to activate it had chosen, deliberately, not to. When Carney finally moved, it was slight. A small shift forward, a lift of the gaze toward the microphones, and the room, which had been holding something without quite knowing what it was holding, seemed to tighten further in anticipation, because everyone present had just spent several seconds inside a silence that had been allowed to grow rather than be cut short. And now the person who had allowed it to grow was about to speak, not in reaction, not in defense, but in something that, within the next 60 seconds, would reframe the entire structure of the exchange, not by matching the force that had been used against him, but by replacing it with something the room had not yet seen from anyone in that space, something that did not require force at all. His voice came out controlled. Not lowered for effect, not sharpened for impact, not adjusted in any way that announced itself as a response to provocation. It simply arrived at the same register it would have if the word pathetic had never been spoken. And that, more than anything in the first seconds of his reply, was what changed the atmosphere. Because when someone insults you in public and you respond without any acoustic evidence that the insult landed, you have already communicated something before a single sentence of substance has been delivered. You have communicated that the terms of the exchange have not been accepted, that the emotional framework being offered has been declined, that whatever happens next will be structured on different ground entirely. Carney began, not with the insult and not with a rebuttal. He began with reality. Canada, he stated, was not a peripheral actor in the relationship that had just been characterized on that stage. It was not a dependent, not a subordinate, not a country whose negotiating position could be reduced to a single dismissive word without consequence to the credibility of whoever used it. It was structurally central, economically integrated at a level that did not function through Canadian dependence on American generosity, but through mutual architecture built across decades by both governments, both economies, both sets of industries that could not be simply reassigned or replaced, energy flows, defense frameworks, trade integration so embedded in the operational structure of both nations that removing it cleanly was not a negotiating option. It was a disruption scenario, and disruption at that scale does not injure only the smaller party. Each sentence he delivered added weight without adding volume. There was no escalation in his tone, no moment where his composure cracked and revealed something underneath that Trump could point to as emotional instability or defensive overreaction. Just precision. The kind of precision that lands differently than aggression because it does not invite the same response. Aggression can be met with aggression. Emotion can be dismissed as weakness. But precise, structural, factually grounded argument delivered without any visible personal investment in the reaction it receives is far more difficult to neutralize in real time, in front of cameras, in a room where everyone is watching for the next move. Trump's expression did not break, but something in the room's attention did, and that shift, quiet as it was, invisible to anyone not watching closely enough, was the first sign that the structure of the exchange had already begun to move in a direction that no one in Washington had scheduled for that morning. What Carney said next was not loud. It was not long. But it was the kind of statement that does not leave a room the same way it entered one. And what Trump did in the seconds immediately after hearing it would become the only thing anyone in that room could talk about when the cameras finally stopped rolling. Because what happened next was not part of any script that Washington had prepared. And it was not something that anyone who watched it would be able to explain away as routine. The turning point did not arrive with noise. It never does in moments that actually matter. The confrontations that reshape perception, that move the invisible line between dominance and exposure, almost never announce themselves with volume. They arrive quietly, inside a sentence, inside a pause, inside the specific choice of how to frame something that has already been said by someone else. And what Carney did next was exactly that. He did not reach for a counter-insult. He did not attempt to reclaim dignity through force. He did not raise his voice to match the register of what had been used against him. Instead, he did something that requires a specific kind of discipline that very few people in high-pressure public environments actually possess. He reframed the word entirely without repeating it once. He began by describing, in plain and measured language, what happens inside complex international relationships when frustration replaces the structure, not as a lecture, not as a correction delivered from a position of moral superiority, but as an observation, the kind of observation that lands harder than an attack because it does not position itself as one. He spoke about how easily the reality of deeply integrated systems gets reduced in moments of political pressure to language that satisfies an audience in the short term, but misrepresents the actual architecture of what exists. How a word chosen for impact in a press conference does not change the pipelines, the supply chains, the defense agreements, the cross-border frameworks that continue functioning regardless of what language surrounds them on a given afternoon. How credibility in international settings is not built in single moments of rhetorical dominance. It is built across patterns of consistency. And how quickly it can be reinterpreted when the language used publicly does not match the structural reality that every economist, every trade analyst, and every informed observer already understands. He was not attacking Trump. He was doing something more precise than that. He was holding the word pathetic up to the light of factual context and allowing the room to see, without being told directly, exactly how much it weighed against reality. And that technique, subtle as it appeared on the surface, was one of the most sophisticated things anyone in that room had witnessed in years of covering exchanges at this level, because it required Trump to either